there's a few things. Okay, so I love hearing about when you go into a group thinking, I think it was the likeness gap, when you think you're gonna be liked. I mean, it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, I guess, but in
Yeah.
a good way. When you think people are gonna like you, that you're well received. Am I putting
Yeah.
that right? I
You
just
are, you
okay.
are. So, I think one of the biggest barriers to making friends is people think they'll be rejected. And you kind of just brought up the liking gap, which is this research that finds that when strangers interact and predict how liked they are by the other person, they underestimate how liked they are. And the more self critical they are, the more pronounced this liking gap is. So, one of the things I advise for making friends is to assume people like you. Because when researchers told people you're going to go into a group and be liked, people actually became more likable. They were friendlier, they were warmer, and it was a self fulfilling prophecy. Whereas we see that the people that are most likely to reject you are the ones that fear rejection. Because when we're afraid of rejection, according to one study, we tend to be cold and withdrawn toward other people because we think they might be rejecting us, right? And so we get into the self protection mode. And so we have this self-fulfilling prophecy too. When we think people are going to reject us, it triggers a series of behaviors that make rejection more likely.
There was something also about a beautiful mess
Yeah.
that I can you explain that?
Yeah. So across the board, we find that the research shows that we have this negativity bias, wherein when we predict how we come off socially, our predictions are skewed toward the negative and are inaccurate. So we talked about that in regard to the liking gap, that people actually like us more than we think, but we also find that that's true with vulnerability. When we're vulnerable, we underestimate how positively people perceive us. And it's also true with affection. When we share affection toward people, we underestimate how much they like it, overestimate how awkward it is. When we reach out to a friend to reconnect, we underestimate just how much they'll value it. When we say no to someone, we overestimate how negatively they'll respond to it. So, across the board, we see that generally the world is safer than our brain is telling us, and that our brain tends to remember all these negative experiences and ignore all of the positive. So, one way to facilitate social connection is to correct for this, right? Because if we're always assuming the worst, it's going to be very hard to then be vulnerable, then initiate, then reconnect with people, right? And so the more that we can assume, if I am vulnerable, people might actually really value it or like it. Or if I initiate, they might be open to it. That assuming people like you piece, I think from the beginning when you're initiating new friendship, but throughout the life course of the friendship can really help the friendship be more maintained. The research finds that this youngest generation their mental health was most affected by the pandemic. And I think that in general, when we go through long bouts of loneliness, it kind of makes our social skills ebb a little bit. And that's natural. Social loneliness is linked to social anxiety over time. So we all felt a little weird and awkward, and not all of us are out of that. If you feel like I can't take social cues, or I feel like I'm blabbing, or I'm worried that people don't like me, right? Those are all kind of signs of social anxiety. And that definitely happened in the pandemic. And many people also reported being very exhausted by social interaction. So it was hard on us. But I want to say that because I want to say that if it was hard on you and you felt like now I feel like I'm weird, that you're not alone and that everybody is like that. So they're not judging you as much as you think because they're probably judging themselves.
I actually have to I find myself having to put on the calendar. Everyone wants to have lunch. I don't have time for lunch, but I will meet you to go for a walk.
Hmm.
But I have to put that on my calendar because I won't take the time to get outside. I work from home for everything. That's my new thing, is putting things like that on the calendar. But meeting new people is not that easy. I've gone on a few retreats and I meet people at some of them and I don't at others. So just kind of
Mm.
depends. So what do you recommend?
I recommend pursuing a hobby in community with others. So if you like to paint or hike or even eat, you can join a supper club. Just doing that in a group. And then you have repeated unplanned interaction and shared vulnerability, which means that you meet up repeatedly over time and it's in your calendar. No one has to schedule it. And people are more unguarded because there's this sociologist, Rebecca Adams, and that's what she argues is needed for friendship to just sort of happen more organically. And we have that in childhood, right? School, lunch, recess, gym, but we don't have that as adults. So we need to find ways to recreate it. And when you do that, you capitalize on something called the mere exposure effect, which is our unconscious tendency to like people just because they're familiar to us. So in this study, these researchers planted women into a psychology lecture, and at the end of the semester, no one remembered the woman because it was a big lecture, but they reported liking the woman who showed up to the most lectures 20% more than the one that didn't show up for any. So, what that means is when you join this group that's repeated over time, in 2 to 3 months, you're going to feel very differently. You're going to like them more, they're going to like you more. It also means that at the beginning, it's going to be awkward. You're going to feel weary. You don't know them. You don't trust them, right? That's not a sign to abandon the group. That's just a sign that you're in the process of connecting. That's a necessary part of the process and experience of discomfort or awkwardness.
Right. So give it time. I love the idea of what you did with your friends with you get together every however often
Yeah.
and switch houses and have a meal and
One person hosts, gets all the
yeah.
food. And I've done
Yeah.
that in so many ways. And like you, Lauren, I like to use the things that I want to do anyway and just do them in community, right? You want to walk anyway. So why not do that with someone else? For me, I wanted to learn Spanish. So we had La Cena, which was our dinner where we'd all speak Spanish together. I wanted to write a book. So I had this writing critique group. I wanted to do work that wasn't related to my main job. So I had a life hustle group where we met up and co-work together. Like I just love starting all of these different groups because they help me achieve my goals. They give me a certain amount of accountability to hang out with my friends.
Yeah.
And not only that, like I teach this class on loneliness, and one of my classes is very connected, and the other isn't as connected. And I wondered, what's the difference? In one of these classes, they hang out outside of class, and the other class, they don't really. And so I found my observation is the difference is that one of these classes has an igniter, which I define as an igniter is the person who creates a group, who's willing to risk rejection and say to everybody, hey, does anyone want to get lunch after class? Anybody is welcomed, right? And then because there's that one igniter, 10 different people in that class have more community. 10 different people in this class feel more connected because one person was willing to ask. So I feel like if we can develop more igniters who create these opportunities for connection, who create continuous unplanned interaction and shared vulnerability, who create infrastructure, who are really willing to risk that rejection, then so many more people will be more connected, even if they're not having to be as active in forming those connections.
So what tools do you use for when you're sluggish? I'm not talking depression where, like a real clinical depression, but what are your tools? Do you meditate? You had mentioned meditation before.
Yeah.
You journal.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to loneliness, research finds that if we spend our alone time more active than passive, we feel less lonely. So, like, if I'm like, oh, I have this night alone, so let me go see that museum or take a walk in the park versus let me sit at home and watch Love is Blind 5 episodes. Hello, last night.
Yeah.
Then we're going to feel more lonely. So that's one thing. I do have this one day where I choose to spend the time alone, even if I do feel
Yeah.
lonely for the recharging. But
No,
if,
it's important.
yeah,
Yeah.
but if there's other days where I'm like, I would rather be around people, but I'm lonely and no one's available, I'd probably try to spend it more actively. Like go on a date with myself, for example, to feel not lonely, but more alone. Like I think the people that feel alone rather than lonely, they're able to see their alone time as an offering and ask themselves, what do I want to do with this offering of time with myself?
Yeah. No, that I love that. And you've actually got me thinking I'm going to do a meditation group.
That's
Yeah,
awesome.
that just is so good. Do you have a message of hope that you want to give?
Well, I do. When my niece read my book, she said, for friendship to happen, someone has to be brave. So be brave.